Chapter 4 I Will Do the Best I Can. U.S. Grant became a public hero because of the conquest of Forts Henry and Donelson. Yet, in the process, he managed to get most of his superiors angry at him, in particular, Halleck, who suddenly perceived Grant's newfound popularity as a threat. After all, while Grant had captured an entire Confederate army at Donelson, the first significant Union victory of the war, the so-called Commander of the West had been seated squarely behind his desk in St. Louis and receiving no credit for it, try as he might. To make things worse, Halleck's impulse in the days that followed was to slow Grant down by ordering him not to press on and take Nashville, which was within easy reach. While the bewildered Grant felt duty bound to obey these orders, he saw nothing wrong with ordering the 12,500 men Buell had sent as reinforcements, when it appeared that a siege would be needed to force Donelson's surrender, forward to capture Nashville on their own, which they did, bloodlessly, a few days later. This in turn caused Buell to become angry at Grant, too, because it had been his ardent desire to ride into the important southern city at the head of his troops, and not have them ordered there under another general. Not only that, but Halleck also embarked on the campaign to discredit Grant to Halleck's own boss, George McClellan, charging that Grant had failed to communicate with him, Halleck, after taking Fort Donelson, and had gone without permission to Nashville. He accused Grant of neglect and inefficiency, concluding, "It is hard to ensure a successful general immediately after a victory, but I think he richly deserves it." A few days later, Halleck added a postscript. "A rumor has just reached me," he wrote, "that since the taking of Fort Donelson, General Grant has resumed his former bad habits, the drinking." McClellan, who possibly remembered Grant's insobriety a decade earlier in California, replied, "Do not hesitate to arrest him at once if the good of the service requires it." So now it seemed that everybody was mad at Grant, including the commanding general of the army, except for Abraham Lincoln, who recognized a winner when he saw one, and successfully submitted Grant's name to the Senate for confirmation as a major general of volunteers. Such was Grant's naivety, that in the midst of all this backstabbing, he wrote to his wife, "There are not two men in the United States who I would prefer serving under than Halleck and McClellan." But Halleck had further ideas for Grant's undoing, and relegated the new major general to the backwaters of Fort Donelson. Being anxious, as was Grant, to capitalize on the present disarray of the Confederate army, Halleck ordered an expedition of nearly 10,000 and 50 transport ships to proceed amphibiously along the Tennessee River, laying waste to bridges, railroads, telegraph lines, and other war-aiding communications and infrastructure, then to establish an advanced base near the northern Mississippi border from which the entire army could operate. To lead this important mission, Halleck selected one of Grant's division commanders, C. F. Smith, and though Grant respected, even loved, his old former West Point commandant of cadets, the humiliation of being grounded by Halleck actually brought him to tears. It was just one step above being relieved of command, and Grant wrote sadly to Halleck saying that he would resign if it was in the interest of the service. Then fate played into Grant's hands, without him knowing why at all. The unpleasant rumors about him and his drinking and neglect and inefficiency had finally reached Lincoln, who probably saw them for what they were and ordered Halleck, in effect, to put up or shut up regarding those charges. This alone must have given the general a start when another bombshell landed. Tiring of McClellan's unremitting pomposity and posturing at his command headquarters in Washington, Lincoln ordered Little Mac to get out from behind his desk and go to the field to personally take charge of the Federal Army in Virginia, which was supposed to be moving on Richmond. With McClellan gone as general and chief of the Union Army, Lincoln put Halleck in command of all the forces in the West, the very position he'd been angling for all along. Now that he needed strong fighting generals, such as the one he'd just been trying to sabotage, Halleck immediately realized that, in particular, he needed to rehabilitate Grant. Accordingly, he informed the War Department, and, tactically, Lincoln, that the problems with Grant had been the result of confusion and misunderstandings, all to the effect that Grant was now, and had been all along, an upstanding example of proper soldiering. To Grant himself, Halleck wrote uncontinuously, "You cannot be relieved from your command. There is no good reason for it. Instead of relieving you, I wish you as soon as your new army is in the field to assume an immediate command and lead it on to new victories." As the glow of approval once again shined upon him, another quirk of fate now threw Grant into contact with the man who would ultimately become his closest confidant and best friend, within the army or without, William Sherman. In the months and years that followed, the two of them would be largely credited with winning the Civil War. Yet Sherman arrived on the scene beneath a cloud worse than the one that Grant had just escaped from under, for it was widely believed that Sherman was crazy. But crazy or not, Halleck ordered him to take a division of raw recruits up the Tennessee and join Smith in the destruction of Southern rails and bridges, following which, Grant believed, the Federal Army would set up for a final showdown with the Confederates in the West. Sherman was born February 8, 1820, in Lancaster, Ohio. His father, a prominent lawyer and state Supreme Court justice, died when Sherman was 9, leaving behind a wife, 9 children, and a mountain of debt, and the family was forced to rely for subsistence on the kindness of friends and relatives. Accordingly, Sherman was parceled out to the wealthy Ewing family down the road and treated as one of their own. As a teenager, Sherman grew into a tall, awkward redhead with a somewhat nervous disposition, whose foster father, Thomas Ewing, by now a United States Senator, got him an appointment to the U.S. Military Academy in 1836, when he was only 16. At West Point, Sherman stood out as a model student, ranking high in the class of 1840. In his last year, another Ohio boy entered the academy with the unlikely name of U.S. Grant, and Sherman later claimed he was instrumental in bestowing upon his nickname Sam. Sherman's first assignment was to the Seminole Wars in Florida, where the Indians were resisting their removal to Oklahoma along the Trail of Tears. From there, he was posted to Savannah and Mobile, where, through the wealthy connections of his influential foster father, he mingled easily and well among the local gentry and developed an abiding fondness for the Southern people. But when the Mexican War broke out, instead of being ordered into battle, Sherman found himself relegated to supply duty in California, which galled him almost to distraction and nearly led to his resignation. He sailed around the Horn in the summer of 1846, stopping at Rio de Janeiro, where he went to the opera, and Valparaiso, Chile, which did not impress him, finally reaching Monterey, California, where he found the state in an uproar known as the Bear Flag Revolt, involving General Stephen Kearny and his recent boss, the Pathfinder, then Colonel John C. Fremont. A further uproar was caused by the discovery of gold at the mill of German-born John Sutter, which touched off the California gold rush, and, typically, Sherman found himself embroiled in all these zany events. By then, he was engaged to be wed to his foster sister, Eleanor Ellen Ewing, who was 4 years his junior. In 1850, he went back east long enough to marry her, and, since her father had recently been named Secretary of the Interior, their wedding was attended by practically every political luminary of the day, including the President of the United States. Because of the astonishing monetary inflation caused by the gold rush, Sherman had found that as a married man he could not survive in California on army pay, and requested, and received, orders posting him to billets in the eastern United States. Meantime, as he acquired a growing family, investors persuaded him to return to the West Coast, not as a military officer but as a president of a bank. Sherman accepted, resigning his commission, but, as in so many booming economies that are based on a single, crucial feature, the California market went bust, and so did Sherman's bank. Finding himself back in Ohio with a family to support, he wound up, much to his chagrin, at his foster brother's law firm as a sort of glorified bill collector. This did not last long, however, for after applying for reinstatement in the Army, he learned from the then Secretary of War, John Floyd, that a new military academy in Louisiana was looking for a superintendent, and Sherman was soon appointed to the job, supervising 56 students at an annual salary of $3,500, at what would one day become Louisiana State University. Sherman went to the camp near Baton Rouge alone to organize the budding college, which at that point consisted of only some barracks-type buildings, an armory, and a few classrooms. He threw all his energies into making the school a model of excellence. It got on famously with everyone involved with it, from the governor on down. On New Year's Day, 1860, the Louisiana Seminary of Learning and Military Academy officially opened, but Sherman was increasingly disheartened as war loomed in the wake of the John Brown raid and its aftermath, the election of Lincoln, and the secession of South Carolina. Sherman typified many Northern men of his day. Although his brother John Sherman, a lawyer, had risen to the U.S. Senate as a Republican and was considered an abolitionist, Sherman was pointedly not in that camp. I would not, if I could, he told his foster brother Thomas Ewing, abolish or modify slavery. Negroes in the great numbers that exist here in Louisiana must of necessity be slaves. All the Congresses on earth cannot make the Negro anything else but what he is. He must be subject to the white man, or he must amalgamate or be destroyed. And again, as to the wrongness of slavery in the abstract and slavery in the territories, I do not particularly take issue, but as to abolishing it in the South or turning loose 4 millions of slaves, I would have no hand in it. However, Sherman, like Grant, was adamantly hostile to the very notion of secession. He considered the United States to be a single entity, and that individual states could not simply make off with themselves without the express consent of the majority of states, and therein, of course, was the very grit of the argument. On the question of secession, I am an ultra. I believe in coercion and cannot comprehend how any government can exist unless it defends its integrity. However, the question of the national integrity and slavery should be kept distinct, he wrote to his brother, for otherwise it will gradually become a war of extermination without end. To one of his instructors at the Louisiana Military School, whom he considered a friend, Sherman warned, you people of the South, believe there can be such a thing as peaceable secession. You don't know what you are doing. The country will be drenched in blood. You mistake the people of the North. They are a peaceable people, but an earnest people and will fight too. And they are not going to let this country be destroyed without a mighty effort to save it. The North can make a steam engine, locomotive, or railway car. Hardly a yard of cloth or shoes can you make. You are rushing to war with one of the most powerful, ingeniously mechanical, and determined people on earth, right at your doors. You are bound to fail. Having delivered these harsh but prophetic words of wisdom, Sherman began preparing to extricate himself from Louisiana. At that point, the state had not yet seceded, but he had no trouble seeing what was ahead and was determined to leave the academy in as proper a shape as possible before he turned it over, tidying up books, paying the bills, writing memos. By early February 1861, as other Southern states began leaving the Union, Sherman felt his position in Louisiana was being compromised. In advance even of an ordinance of secession, the Louisiana governor suddenly ordered federal force seized and their arms distributed throughout the state. As a last straw for Sherman, some of these rifles, still in their old familiar boxes with the United States scratched off, were delivered to him for safekeeping in the armory of his military academy. Thus I was made the receiver of stolen goods, he said indignantly, and with that he turned in his resignation and headed north up the Mississippi River. Sherman wasn't sure what he was going to do next, but as late as mid-March 1861, he was fairly certain that there would be no employment for me, and a national crisis, and wrote that I was extremely anxious about the future. It looked like the end of my career. Shortly after he returned north, however, he was offered the presidency of the Fifth Street Railroad, a mule-drawn streetcar service in St. Louis, but he had no sooner accepted and moved his family to Missouri when events overtook him. As state after Southern state left the Union, Lincoln was content to sit back and await developments, and these were not long in coming. When the president called for 75,000 volunteers supplied by every state to put down the rebellion inspired by Beauregard's firing of Fort Sumter, it was an almost unheard of number of men, and the reaction of Southern states that were expected to contribute to this force showed precisely how far sectional feelings had deteriorated. Here, Sherman's family political connections paid off. Within a few days, he was notified by his brother-in-law, Charles Ewing, that he had been appointed colonel of the U.S. 13th Infantry and was to report immediately to Washington, whose inhabitants were hysterically anticipating a Confederate attack at any moment. When this failed to materialize, Sherman was put on inspection duty, and within 3 months was promoted to command an infantry brigade at the Battle of Bull Run, where he turned in an incredible performance during the disgraceful Union defeat. An example of Sherman's style of command is revealed by an amusing anecdote. As he was trying to reorganize his brigade after the retreat from Bull Run, one of his officers, a lawyer, informed him that he was returning to New York because his 3-month term of enlistment had expired. Sherman, in the presence of a number of men, told the officer, without flinching, Captain, if you attempt to leave without orders, it will be mutiny, and I will shoot you like a dog." Later that afternoon, Lincoln himself appeared in his carriage to help buck up the troops. As he and Sherman were sitting in the carriage, the same officer approached and said, "Mr. President, I have a cause of grievance. This morning I went to see Colonel Sherman, and he threatened to shoot me." "Threatened to shoot you?" Lincoln inquired. Then, looking at Sherman, and then back to the man, the President said to him in a loud stage whisper, "Well, if I were you, and he threatened to shoot, I would not trust him. I believe he would do it." The red-faced officer disappeared into the crowd to the tune of laughter by his fellow soldiers. A month had barely passed after the debacle at Bull Run, when Sherman received yet another promotion. He was made a brigadier general and selected to become second in command to General Robert Anderson, the man who had endured the mortification of surrendering Fort Sumter and who was now in charge of the Department of the Cumberland, which included Kentucky and Tennessee. Sherman arrived in Louisville amid a thoroughly confused state of affairs. Not only was the Kentucky legislature contemplating secession, and Confederate officers raising troops from all over the state, but the rebel General Albert Sidney Johnston was then occupying Bowling Green in the south, while General Felix Zollicoffer had entered in the east near the Cumberland Gap, and General Leonidas Polk occupied Columbus on the Mississippi River. Worse, it was reported that a Confederate force under Simon Buckner was moving on Union headquarters at Louisville itself. It seemed to Anderson and to Sherman, when he got there, that everything bad was happening at once, and that they had not the troops in their command to prevent it. Anderson, aging and worn down by the ordeal at Fort Sumter, felt himself under an unbearable strain while Sherman was rushing around trying to put out fires. Then, according to Sherman, Anderson said he could not stand the mental torture of his command any longer, and must go away, where it would kill him. Thus, scarcely a month after he arrived, Sherman found himself commanding the most volatile military department in the country, and the most critical as well, and this is where the assertion that he was crazy entered the picture. As bad luck would have it, Secretary of War Simon Cameron had been on a fact-finding trip to the Western Theater, and decided to look in on Sherman at Louisville. At first, Sherman said he was delighted to have an opportunity to represent the true state of affairs, but then became wary when Cameron not only showed up with an entourage of newspaper reporters, but insisted that they remain in the room while Sherman made his private assessment of the military situation. At one point, during the briefing, Sherman offered his opinion that before the war was over, it would take upwards of 200,000 Union soldiers to subdue the Southerners in his sector, by which he meant the entire Mississippi Valley. This early in the war, such a prophecy naturally elicited alarm by the Secretary of War, but nothing further was said about it during his visit, and Sherman justifiably assumed that his opinion would be kept confidential. It wasn't. Shortly afterward, Cameron asked U.S. Army Adjutant General Lorenzo Thomas, who had been at the meeting, to submit a memorandum of what was discussed, and in particular to address what he called Sherman's insane suggestion that 200,000 troops would be needed. According to Sherman's information, Cameron's communication was somehow leaked to the press, and within a week, newspapers throughout the North were reporting that Sherman was crazy, insane, mad, and that he had demanded 200,000 men for the defense of Kentucky. Likewise, it was reported that an assistant secretary of war had muttered something about Sherman being gone in the head, loony. By Sherman's own account, his position became unbearable, and, he remembered, it is probable that I resented the cruel insult with language of intense feeling. Sherman tried to straighten out the misunderstanding with his superiors, in particular with McClellan, but to no avail. Like Anderson before him, he began to feel the intense pressure of administering a department more than twice as large as the ones in Virginia and Missouri, put together, and with only 1/10 of the troops that the other two department commanders had. With all they talk of insanity, Sherman actually began to wonder about such things himself. After all, two close relatives had been placed in mental asylums, and he even told his wife that he had felt he might be going crazy. He had been in command at Louisville a little over a month when, on November 5th, he wrote to McClellan asking to be relieved. After returning from his restorative leave, Sherman was a different soldier altogether. He was ordered by Halleck to Paducah to organize Grant's supply lines during the battles of Fort Henry and Donelson. Like Grant, Sherman had experience in military supply from his California days. Grant was profoundly grateful for his constant solicitations, which arrived along with each day's supply boat, offering to send down anything within reason that Grant might need: surgeons, nurses, officers, wives, laundresses, even himself, when the caveat that, though he was senior to Grant in grade, he would happily serve under him, no questions asked. With Grant still at Fort Donelson on the Cumberland, Sherman was given a fresh, reinforced division of about 9,000 men to go up to Tennessee and meet there with the rest of Grant's command, now under C.F. Smith. It was by now a formidable force consisting, in addition to Sherman, of the divisions of Stephen A. Hurlbut, Lew Wallace, John A. McClernand, and Benjamin M. Prentiss. Smith's division was now under the command of W. H. L. Wallace, owing to a freak accident so common to the times. Smith had scraped his leg on something rusty getting into one of his small boats, and the wound turned septic. Modern medicine could have cured it easily, but within weeks the gallant old soldier would be dead of blood poisoning. At any rate, Grant steamed deep into Tennessee to resume his command, which was now 42,000 strong, with Buell's army of 35,000 marching overland with Nashville, to join them as swiftly as it could. Enough combined, it was assumed to overwhelm anything the disorganized Confederates might throw at them. With Sherman's division spearheading the invasion, the expedition began disembarking in mid-March 1862 at a small steamboat wharf called Pittsburg Landing that would gain terrible immortality under a new name, Shiloh. Grant rejoined his army on March 17th, making his headquarters in the mansion of a Union sympathizer near the village of Savannah, on the Tennessee River about 6 miles north of Pittsburg Landing. There, under strict orders from Halleck, he would wait for Buell to arrive and in the meanwhile put his army through drilling exercises. He had given no instructions for them to fortify their positions because, as he had said later, he thought fortifications were a demoralizing factor, especially for the newer troops, whom he feared would then become reluctant to fight out in the open if the situation required it. At first, Sherman didn't like it, and he confidentially told newspaper reporters, "We are in great danger here." But as the days went by, and except for a few cavalry patrols, the Confederates showed no intention of coming out from their lair in Corinth. Sherman's words began to vanish. In his mansion at Savannah, Grant paced and smoked his cigars and waited for Buell, confident not only that his army was safe from harm, but that any upcoming battle with the Confederates would be easier than the victory he had just presided over at Fort Donelson. In the morning, he would take the steamboat south to Pittsburg Landing to watch them drill. Intelligence indicated that the Confederates were gathering men to defend Corinth. Rumors had placed their numbers as high as 150,000, but Grant put little stock in this. After all, he had seen Albert Sidney Johnston's rebel retreat almost without a fight all across Kentucky and Tennessee, and now down into Mississippi, and saw no reason to believe they would behave differently now. And this he was mistaken. Johnston was gathering a force at Corinth, but not to defend it. He was planning nothing less than a battle of annihilation, and, as things were shaping up, he might just have the wherewithal to put it off. The alarming reversals in the West had finally shaken Jefferson Davis from his delusion of contesting every inch of Southern soil. It simply could not be done, and now, with an entire Yankee army poised to invade his home state, Davis concluded to meet desperate times with desperate measures. He stripped the Gulf Coast of its defenses, consisting primarily of 10,000 Confederate soldiers under Braxton Bragg, who was headquartered at Mobile. Also ordered up to Corinth were the 5,000 troops at New Orleans under General Daniel Ruggles, who had been in position to defend the South's largest and most important city. Next, he directed Bishop Polk to take 10,000 of the men he had evacuated from Columbus, Kentucky, and head south for the Corinth on the double, even though that would leave precious little to impede a Federal advance straight down the Mississippi River. Finally, the 15,000 troops across the river in Arkansas under Earl Van Dorn, who had just lost the Battle of Elkhorn Tavern, were ordered to move to the ferries at Memphis and pile on the boxcars for Corinth, even though that meant uncovering the state of Arkansas to the Union Army. If all went as planned, when combined with Johnston's 15,000, who were retreating from Bowling Green ahead of Buell's army, burning bridges as they went, it would give the Southerners an army of 55,000 men, enough, it was believed, to whip Grant's 42,000, and then turn on Buell's 35,000 and whip them too, provided the Union commanders didn't link up first. And even if they did, 55,000 Southerners against 77,000 Yankees weren't bad odds. All things considered, or so it was believed in Richmond, still, it was a dangerous gamble, and failure could have dire, even fatal consequences. This would be the Confederacy's first great roll of the dice, though there would be many more before the war ended. Until Johnston arrived, the man in charge at Corinth was the Creole General Pierce Gustave Lieutenant Beauregard, who had made it one of his military callings to commit to memory Gemini's The Art of War, and who became convinced that he had found the perfect prospect for a Confederate victory. As Beauregard saw it, with the exception of Lew Wallace's division posted about 3 miles north, Grant's army languished at Pittsburg Landing, confined between its 75-foot high bluffs along the river and surrounded elsewhere by deep murky creeks and swamps. This was an army without fortifications, without patrols, just sitting there, drilling and housekeeping, waiting for Buell to show up. Hit them now and hit them hard. Beauregard reasoned, and their destruction was at hand. Johnston, still in overall command, agreed with Beauregard in principle, but wanted to wait until all his troops arrived, most especially the 15,000 under Van Dorn, who, though Johnston could not know it, didn't receive his order to join him until March 25th, 6 days after it had been sent. Van Dorn hurried by himself across the river and met with Johnston and Beauregard at Corinth, and assured them he would do everything possible to cross his army into Mississippi. But in the end, it proved not enough, due in part to insufficient shipping. Fearing that Grant was about to turn west and attack undefended Memphis, or that Buell might soon rendezvous his forces with Grant, Johnston decided to fall on Grant immediately, concluding that surprise and Southern ferocity would overcome the absence of Van Dorn's force. On Thursday night, April 3rd, 1862, the rebel army set out from Corinth, 20 miles to the southwest, intending to launch the attack by mid-morning the next day. But things quickly began to go wrong. A terrific wave of thunderstorms and the resulting mud slowed the column's advance. Wagon roads became clogged, artillery bogged down, regiments got lost, whole divisions got lost, even guides got lost. And when all was said and done, it was Sunday, April 6th, when the Confederates were finally in place to begin their assault. At least the rain had stopped, and by Saturday evening the skies were clear and the stars shone hard and bright. The weather had warmed from the previous week, and a southern springtime was in the air. Oaks were tasseling, and there were the beginnings of green shoots on other trees, but the woods were still bare, except for the flowering of dogwoods and redbuds. In an open clover field, a peach orchard was in full pink bloom. Grant's men were in a Western army, boys from Iowa and Indiana, Ohio and Illinois. Back home, it was planting time across the broad, grain-rich plains that soon would wave in oats and wheat and corn enough to feed the entire Union population. For the Southern boys who slept fitfully beside their rifles in the thickets and woods that night, it was planting time, too, but there wasn't much to boast about now. And days gone by the cotton, tobacco, and sugar cane would have gone in after the last freeze, but not this year. Because of the war and the federal blockade, it would rot in the fields or on the wharfs. And though the government in Richmond had pleaded for farmers to grow produce that would help the war effort, not everyone did, for nobody yet knew quite what to expect. During the time between the rebel army's departure from Corinth and its attack at Pittsburg Landing, Beauregard began to argue against the attack, having convinced himself that the delays not only had cost the Confederates the element of surprise, but that Buell had probably come up in the meantime to make the Yankee army over 70,000 strong. But the Creole general was wrong. Grant was still alone. The forwardmost Federal force, consisting of Sherman's division, was in fact reporting rebel activity in its front, but the reports were not credited by headquarters. One Union colonel sent back word that there were Confederates in his front, as thick as fleas on a dog's back, but no one at headquarters seemed concerned. After breakfast on Sunday morning, Sherman himself rode up to find out what the fuss was about, and immediately saw his orderly get shot dead off his horse right next to him. About 8 a.m., Sherman recalled, "I saw the glistening bayonets of the heavy masses of infantry to our left front in the woods beyond the small stream, and became satisfied for the first time that the enemy designed a determined attack on our whole camp. Some of Sherman's regiments simply ran off across the hills and fields toward the river. Others tried to stand up against the onslaught, but finally caved in and fled too. Still, others rallied behind Sherman and other officers and put in a more determined resistance. But by 10 a.m., the Confederates had worked their way around Sherman's positions and got their artillery firing into his rear, at which point the whole force gave away. The colonel who had come up with his own division, and so had Prentiss, but both were appalled by the power of the Confederate charge and slowly gave way. Sherman rallied what was left of two of his brigades and his artillery next to a little wood-planked Methodist chapel, where he had made his headquarters. It was named Shiloh, a Hebrew word meaning place of peace. On the rebels came, overrunning Union positions and on many occasions stopping to eat the stillborn breakfast of Yankee soldiers who had fled, since they themselves had long since devoured their own rations on what they supposed to have been a one-day march. That delay, plus the very speed of their attack, caused many Confederate regiments to become as entangled as the brush and brambles they were charging through, and soon the fighting broke down into scores of smaller battles within the whole. By this time, Sherman had been twice wounded, and had 3 horses shot from under him. A bullet had grazed his hand, which he wrapped in a handkerchief, and another ripped off his shoulder shaft. But when a courier from headquarters arrived to ask about the situation, the Ohioan simply replied, "Tell General Grant if he has any men to spare, I can use them. If not, I will do the best I can." About this time, Grant himself appeared on the field. He, too, had been having his Sunday breakfast at the mansion at Savannah, when he heard the uproar to the south and ordered a steamboat to carry him there post haste. On the way, he slowed down at Crump's Landing, long enough to yell to Lew Wallace to get his division prepared to march immediately, and then he proceeded toward the sound of the guns. During the same thunderstorm that had deluged the Confederates 2 nights earlier, Grant's horse had slipped in mud and landed on top of his ankle, which left him walking on a crutch and unable to mount without help. Now, with the crutch strapped on his saddle, Grant debarked at Pittsburg Landing, dismayed at the seemingly endless line of stragglers and fugitives retreating from the fight to safety beneath the tall bluffs along the river. The situation was clearly critical, but Grant somehow managed to remain calm, where other men might have faltered. He rode into the eye of the battle to each of his division commanders, and to some, such as Prentiss, another political general who was fairly new to the game, he gave orders, "Maintain your position at all hazards," and to others, Sherman in particular, he simply indicated for them to do the best they could. Although they were winning, the Confederates were faced with a different but no less difficult prospect: the confusion that results from an army outstripping its objectives. To sort this out, Johnston and Beauregard told all 4 corps commanders to align themselves in a southeast to northwest axis, and to continue pushing the Yankees toward the river and the swamps. In fact, the Federals had been pushed back to within less than a mile of the river, along a line anchored in the south by Peach Orchard, and on the north by a particularly vicious clump of brambles that the Confederates dubbed the Hornet's Nest, connected roughly by a half-mile or so of an old wagon rut known as the Sunken Road. To clear the Hornet's Nest, Daniel Ruggles, the old rebel general from New Orleans, dragged up 62 cannons and proceeded to blast the Union soldiers out of their positions and back towards the bluffs and the river, killing in the process General W.H.O. Wallace, whose division quickly joined the rest in flight. Down at the Peach Orchard, things were not going quite as well for the attackers. The fighting was so heavy, and the day had become so hot, that the soldiers from both sides, including many wounded, found sustenance at a small body of water in a clearing, just next to a copse of woods. As the afternoon wore on this, after, I'm sorry, as the afternoon wore on this became known as the Bloody Pond, where both Yankees and rebels filled their canteens and washed and tended their wounds, adhering to an unspoken pact not to fire on each other. Successive charges on the Peach Orchard finally dislodged the Yankee defenders, but not before a Confederate tragedy occurred. Seeing that his officers were having difficulty getting their soldiers to rush yet again into that deadly tumult, Albert Sidney Johnston rode among them shouting, "I will lead you, I will lead you," and did just that, returning to the cheers of his finally victorious men, his uniform torn by bullet holes, including one in his boot. It seemed a slight wound at first, but suddenly he began to collapse in his saddle, and when he was helped to the shelter of a ravine to discover the reason, it was found that a Menet ball had severed an artery just behind the knee, and that he was rapidly bleeding to death. Tennessee Governor Isham Harris, who had fled the capital Nashville when Union forces arrived, was serving as Johnston's aide-de-camp. He tried to stem the flow of blood, but within a few minutes the commanding general of the Confederate Department of the West was dead. And by then, it was mid-afternoon, and command devolved to Beauregard, who ordered the fighting to go on with renewed fury. So far, the Confederates had pushed the Federals out of the hornet's nest, the peach orchard, and finally, as the afternoon sun began to wane, from the sunken road as well. In that last action, the rebel attack was so fast and furious that it completely surrounded Prentice's division, and its commander was forced to surrender what was left of the nearly 6,000 men he had started the day with, as well as all his artillery. With Sherman's, McClernand's, Hubbard's, and H.W. Wallace's divisions pushed back nearly to the Tennessee River, and Prentice surrendered with his 2,200 survivors. All that was left, it seemed, was one final concerted slashing bayonet charge by the whole Confederate force, and Beauregard would have had Grant's army bag and baggage. But it did not turn out that way. Like the Federals, the Confederates were exhausted, used up by the exertion and constant horror of a full day's battle that had begun at sunrise and hadn't let up, even at sundown, and the rebel charges began feebler because of casualties and straggling. In the gathering darkness, Beauregard figured it was enough for today. He was content that his army had sent Grant's men, reeling with their backs to the river, captured 2 scores of their guns, and took as prisoners the remnants of an entire Union division, including its commander. There would be time enough tomorrow to finish off the job. Beauregard's greatest fear at this point was that Grant's army might escape on the steamboats during the night. What he did not know, however, though he ought to have anticipated or at least suspected it, was that Buell's army had finally appeared, and with it the salvation of Grant. As well, Lew Wallace, whom Grant had shouted at from his steamboat as it passed Crump's Point that morning, had at long last arrived with his fresh division, after spending most of the day floundering around lost in the Tennessee River swamps. Grant had given over his field headquarters for a hospital and spent the night under a tree down by the bluffs, in a driving rainstorm that had come up from the west, heartened no doubt as Buell's troops, some 20,000 of them by daybreak, arrived by ferry from across the river. Just across the way, Beauregard's men slept next to their rifles and the bodies of the dead of both sides, which, it was said, now covered the battleground so thickly a man could walk across it, using them as stepping stones. But the general remained confident that sunrise would see the destruction of the Yankee invaders. Just before going to sleep, he telegraphed Richmond that the fighting had ended in a complete victory, driving the enemy from every position. When dawn finally came, however, the noise of battle resumed, not from the Confederates, who were still waiting orders, but from the enemies. Grant's army was coming on. The startled Confederates at first gave way as the Yankee brigades recaptured places now memorialized in histories of the Civil War: the Peach Orchard, the Hornet's Nest, Bloody Pond, the Sunken Road. But the rebel disorganization soon was rectified, and just before the Blue Clydes reached the Shiloh Chapel, now serving as Beauregard's headquarters instead of Sherman's, Confederate artillery began to blast away at the oncoming Federals, and the lines of rebel infantry began to murder the Union ranks with rifle fire. By mid-afternoon, both sides were again worn out, and Beauregard had to face the reality that Buell's men were now arriving in force. There was no choice, he said afterward, but to order the army back into the fortifications of Corinth. For their part, the Federals had had enough as well. Having retaken their camps and what was left of their possessions, the fight was out of them. All, that is, except Sherman, who, as revenge for his humiliation the previous day, decided to give chase. He might as well not have bothered, because he was about to be taught a lesson by a man who knew how to teach them well. On Tuesday, April 8th, the day after the major fighting had ended, Sherman took most of his division and a regiment of cavalry to see if further damage could be done to the Confederates, who had been retreating all night in a violent sleet storm that had returned to the weather icy again. All he found along the Corinth road were rebel hospital tents filled with the dead and dying, and those too injured to be moved. About 6 miles out, Sherman encountered a rebel encampment at an old logging site that had been clear and cut, and, seeing gray-clad cavalry milling around inside it, ordered an attack. His infantry regiment was sent out as skirmishers, flanked by the cavalry regiment, while a brigade marched up behind. If Sherman had known who was inside the rebel camp, he might have had second thoughts, or at least proceeded more cautiously, because the man in charge of the rebel cavalry troop was Nathan Bedford Forrest. Instead of doing the prudent thing and galloping off, Forrest ordered his 300 troopers to charge directly at Sherman's oncoming soldiers, who numbered at least several thousand. At this audacious performance, Sherman's skirmishers threw down their rifles and ran away, followed by the cavalry regiment as Forrest's men tore into them. Sherman quickly found himself in the position of a man who was cornered as a who was sorry. Sherman quickly found himself in the position of a man who has cornered a beast in the woods, only to find that it is meaner than he is. Known for his almost unimaginable personal courage and daring, Forrest had galloped so hard that at first he did not realize he had outraced his own men, and suddenly he found himself alone among the disorganized but still dangerous enemy, who closed in, shouting, "Kill him! Kill him!" With saber in one hand and blazing pistol in the other, his horse rearing and plunging, Forrest demonically lashed out until one blue cloak pushed the barrel of his rifle into Forrest's side and pulled the trigger, sending a bullet tearing into his back. Enraged, Forrest reached down and snatched one of his tormentors by the collar and hoisted him up behind him on the horse. Then, employing his startled passenger as a shield, he galloped through the tumult of gunfire and bayonets back to his own lines, where he unceremoniously dumped the amazed enemy soldier to the ground. After that, Sherman, too, decided he had had enough, and the Battle of Fallen Timbers became the final engagement of the Shiloh campaign. The American public, North and South, was shocked, then outraged, as news of the deadly struggle became known. Approximately 20,000 men had been killed and wounded, and about equal numbers for each side. Moreover, the Union had lost nearly 3,000 captured, and the Confederates became some 1,000. Nothing like it had ever happened before in the Western Hemisphere. Indeed, more men fell at Shiloh, and most of them on one day, than the entire number of American dead and wounded during the Revolutionary War, the War of 1812, and the Mexican War combined. Based on the conduct of the Confederates at Fort Henry and Donelson, and their flight from Kentucky and Tennessee, Grant, like so many others, had convinced himself that victory in a single great battle will cause the Confederacy to dissolve. However, after Shiloh, he reached the conclusion that the only way to restore the Union was a total subjugation of the South.